Walk down here and kind of look at some of that. So let's just kind of start here. So Mitchell's question was, you know, how do we look at selecting what species to put in, whether it's in 30-inch or 60-inch or 90-inch? You know, what's the logic or what's the thinking behind what species do we choose to help cycle nutrients? And a lot of it goes back to, you know, kind of what your goal is. This kind of basic mix, I don't know what we call it, the 101 mix. It's kind of the traditional cover crop mix that we've seen work pretty well in 30-inch corn. And when I say work pretty well, the number one limiting factor in a cover crop under 30-inch corn is always going to be sunlight. It's just always going to be sunlight starved. And if you have a hailstorm come through and knock a bunch of your corn leaves off, it will help the cover crop immensely. Seed corn fields, you can really make that work because you get tremendous amount more sunlight through a seed corn field than you do commercial corn. But these are some things that we've seen work pretty well. You know, hairy vetch and red clover are the legumes. And there's kind of two strategies that you want to think about when you're trying to get something to live in a shaded environment. One of them is to use a cool season species that you can get established when it's still a little bit cool. The heat of the summer will kind of send it into a little bit of a semi-dormant state so it doesn't have to grow a lot, because a plant needs sunlight to photosynthesize to stay alive. So somehow you have to overcome the lack of sunlight. So one of it is to have a cool season plant that goes semi-dormant in the heat of the summer. This time of year, as the canopy is breaking down, it's cooling off, it gets sunlight, it can take off and grow. And so that's kind of the theory behind the vetch and the clover. Same way with the annual ryegrass. In looking in here, you know, there's some annual ryegrass, you know, that's coming in here. Annual ryegrass is one of the more shade-tolerant grasses, and it will go kind of into a semi-dormant state when you have extended temperatures over 85 degrees. So it's a pretty good one to kind of get established, set down under that canopy and wait. Rapeseed is just kind of an inexpensive brassica that we threw in here. It's the same thing as winter canola. And then buckwheat. Buckwheat is not a cool season plant. It's a warm season plant that grows very quickly. The theory here is that it can get up, it can get going, and it can try to kind of keep out ahead of the corn. This is what buckwheat looks like. And buckwheat is one of the best plants for cycling and making phosphorus available. So we like using buckwheat, particularly in areas where you know you're going to be short on phosphorus, or you're wanting to pull back on the amount of phosphorus that you're putting on. Buckwheat, because buckwheat does not associate with mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhiza is how most plants get a lot of their natural phosphorus from the soil. Buckwheat does not form those associations strongly. So buckwheat has had to adapt, and the root exudates of buckwheat are a strong enough type of acid that can actually convert the mineral phosphorus in your soil, the non-organic sources. It can convert it to a form that the buckwheat plant can use. And now when that buckwheat plant dies and decomposes, now that phosphorus is available. It's in the organic form, and so now it's available to the next crop. And so we'll see, you almost always will see increases in your available phosphorus following buckwheat. And biological activity in general, and there's countless farmers, you know, Gabe Brown, and you know, just hold down the list. Almost everybody will tell you they have not used any phosphorus fertilizers for years, and their phosphorus levels on soil tests continue to go up and up and up. It's because they're unlocking what's there with the biological activity. I love telling this story. Terry's boss, Ray Ward, I was at a field day with Ray a few years ago, and we had Christine Jones was there talking, and she was talking about this whole concept of, you know, how much phosphorus is in the soil, and so she asked Ray, because Ray has a farm in Nebraska there. She said, Ray, how much phosphorus do you have in your soil? You know, and you know, Ray being a soil scientist, of course, you know 30 parts per million or whatever, and she said, no, I'm not talking about what's available to the plant, because that's what you see on a soil test is what's available for the plant to get. She said, I'm talking about total phosphorus, total mineral phosphorus in your soil. Now, most of us would have no idea how much total phosphorus we have in our soil, but again, because Ray owns his own soil lab, he knew that number. And then she asked him this question: how many years of crops could you grow if that phosphorus was all available? And he started doing a little figuring on his paper, and it kind of took him a little while to, you know, because it's like, well, that can't be right. And so and finally he looks up and he says, I've got enough phosphorus in my soil to grow crops for the next 10,000 years. And she said, yeah, you do. And so does everybody else in this room. You know, most of these soils, you know, the parent material, they're rich in minerals, but they're locked up in a form that plants can't get to. God never designed plants to extract minerals from the soil directly. It all goes through the biology. And when you're farming, when you have no biology, your plants are going to look like this, and then we have to step in and add the synthetic inputs. Or we have to figure out a way to increase, enhance, build up our biological activity to where we can start naturally releasing what's already there. Same way with nitrogen. You know, there's 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre out here. 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre of crop ground, but plants can't get any of it. None, zero. So we have to, again, that all has to go through the biology. It has to go through either rhizobia bacteria that will nodulate on legumes, but there's many other types of biology that can take atmospheric nitrogen and make it available to the plant. It's not just for legumes. Legumes are the only ones that will nodulate with the rhizobia, but there's other things like Zotobacter and Azospirillum, some different things like this that can be producing nitrogen, and those levels will build as you farm in this sort of a way. So we will see this improve. We'll see that natural cycling, making nitrogen available out of the atmosphere. So that's why we like buckwheat, because it makes phosphorus more available. We did not have a lot of legumes in this based on our experience. So number one, legumes are expensive. Okay, so if you're wanting to keep your costs down, you have to kind of limit how much legumes you have. And so there's a little bit of vetch and clover. We're not necessarily looking at that to provide a lot of nitrogen for this crop, because in a shaded environment, it's just not going to happen. Now, there is another strategy that a lot of organic guys will use in this situation is they will go with warm season legumes like a cowpea that can grow very fast, very rapidly, and it's a viney type, and it can actually vine all the way up to the top of those corn plants. And now it has leaves at the top of the canopy, so it can photosynthesize enough to stay alive. It's a little riskier, it's a little more competitive environment, because now instead of that plant growing and going dormant and kind of hanging out and not bothering the corn, it's going to be a little more aggressive. So you have to be careful on the timing, you have to be careful on the seeding rates, but that's certainly another way that you can utilize a legume to help feed this crop. And we'll see a lot more of that as we widen our rows out and we have a lot more sunlight for the cover crops. Now it opens up, it fundamentally changes how we would design these mixes, because now we can have nitrogen production as a main goal. I'm convinced in traditional 30-inch corn, there's not enough sunlight there. It's not going to be worth the investment of, you know, $40, $50 an acre to try to grow your nitrogen in a 30-inch row. Over here in these wider rows, I think it can be, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So,
hey Keith, I gotta interrupt you a second. When I asked for cover crop 101, I thought it was just going to be cereal rye. And what you just described is there's a real dynamic interaction of a number of the plants, even in a relatively simple cover crop mix. So would it be your advice to folks that says if you just plant one species like a cereal rye as a cover crop and check the box, the feel good button, are you missing an opportunity by not incorporating some of the biology thing going on?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's no shame in planting cereal rye by itself if it's late enough in the season that that's the only thing that makes sense.
Okay.
And there's a lot of times it's late enough in the season, that's the only thing that makes sense. And it's a hell of a lot better than planting nothing. And you can plant cereal rye all the way up through Thanksgiving. I'm sure you guys planted it in December. Cereal rye is just the toughest thing you've ever seen. You can plant it just about any time. It's going to work. But if you're planting in June and you only plant one thing, that's embarrassing. Come on. You can do better than that, because you have lots of other choices of things that will work. So we don't want to add diversity just to say we had 15 things. if we know only 2 of them are going to work. So we want to choose things that will work given the conditions and the time frame when we're doing it. But yes, if you're doing a monoculture in a situation where you have the opportunity to do a lot of good diversity, yeah, that you left a lot on the table with that. But if it's, you know, if it's October 20th here and you're asking me what cover crop should you plant, I have no problem whatsoever if you just want to plant cereal rye and call it a day. That's a really good option at that
Thank
point.
you. Yep.
I've been asked that question before, but many times.
So I have a question. You know, he's got this do nothing strip here where he's not doing anything. Should he be putting something simple like a cereal rye after harvest in that one?
Well, good question. So the question is should he put a cereal rye in that? And I think the bigger question could be, should he put cereal rye in all of this?
Okay.
Yeah.
And I would say, if it was mine, yes, I would. For a couple of reasons. Number one, we've got a lot of biomass down here in these cover crop strips. We're coming back to corn. It's going to be important for us to start cycling that biomass. There's a lot of nutrients. You know, there was not a lot of nutrients added, but all of this is pulling nutrients up. If you took a clipping of some of this and sent it into the lab, you know, there's going to be 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen, and there's probably 30 parts of phosphorus. There's nutrients here. Now the goal is going to be, can we get them to start cycling and coming back available for next year's corn crop? Because if we're going to stay committed to, you know, the no or low input system, we've got to start releasing this. We've got to be pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and we got to release the nutrients that are in the soil. And it can be done. It's going to be done quicker. You know, roots are going to do that. Roots build biology. Biology cycles the nutrients. And so if you want to have the maximum amount of weed control, just roll this flat on the ground and do nothing and just leave it there. And you know, there's not enough biology in this soil yet. You will find some of this residue 3 years from now laying out here yet, if the biology does not increase in these soils. And we saw that all the time. When we first started no-tilling, we moved from conventional or kind of a minimum till to no-till. You know, we thought we were pretty cool because we could go out in our no-till fields and we could, if you knew what your crop rotation was, you could find corn stalks from the previous year, you could find bean stalks from 2 years before that, and you could find some corn stalks yet from 3 years ago. And we thought that was great. Look at all this residue we're putting on the soil. And in some ways that was good because, you know, we're protecting the soil. But what we now know is that all that was telling us is that our biology sucked and we weren't cycling that stuff. And then we got to the point now where, you know, we can grow 250 bushel irrigated corn and come out this time of year and you can't hardly find a stalk out there because it's just that much more active, and it's consuming it, and it's cycling it. And as your soils get to that point, you will have to change the composition of your cover crop mixes, or you will run yourself out of residue and you'll start going backwards. Yeah.
This correlates with that. Do you have, or this with you too, Bob, did you guys happen to do a test to see your bacteria to fungal ratio in the soil, kind of as a baseline to work off of by adding the cover crops to different species and over time, hopefully building that up?
Okay, so in my introductions I missed because Michael Cook is around here someplace. Hold up your hand. Mike is another guy who has a plot just like this, sort of a replication of it in Waterloo, and he's much more aggressive on farmers market stuff. So, and Ray, Terry is from Ward Lab, and we have done soil sampling tests as of about a month or so ago, and we've done some looking at the biology. We've done some analysis of that. We've done a little bit of PLFA, which is really expensive, I know that, and we've done some Haney tests. So we're trying to capture what the before is, and always and kind of, I'm going to be defensive now, but I'm pretty stubborn about leaving this like if I just did what Daddy always did, you know. And one of the reasons for that is we want to keep soil sampling that. And I don't know how far the bugs move, but we're going to try to have these strips here that are situation normal, if you will. there's somebody else I need. Is Neil Sass here yet? No.
Yeah, he's here.
Over here.
There he is. Okay, yep. And so Keith is doing a great job of describing what's going on up above, but we're really trying to activate what's below. So we're measuring the soil then below, but that's an 8-inch deal. So Neil came over here the other day, and so we've got soil samples going down to 4 feet, just looking at the chemistry, looking at the composition and all of that. So, and it's pretty spooky because you can see that we're kind of living on the edge of good times here by what soil we have. So
The reason I ask that is because soil that's typically higher fungal, you know, closer to that 1-to-1 with bacteria will break down your residue because the biology's working more. And I didn't know if you did that. The reason I asked is because I did it on my farm just this year. It was the first time this certain farm had been no-tilled, so I thought.
I would say they have that
baseline to work off.
information. There would be almost no fungal out here. Yeah.
Very minimal, probably.
I'll speak to that. We do have a PLFA for the diverse mix in the 90 inchers, and it's all bacteria. There is no fungal. We don't have one for the other no cover crop and all that. Just Bob chose to do it that way, but we do have a handy test for both of them.
Yep. Yeah, I was just looking at it. Cool.
So it'll come, but it's, you know, fungal populations are hard to build, and again, if you want to jumpstart your fungal populations as quickly as possible, grow as much biomass as you can and run it through an animal, and do it at least twice in a year, and then that will be the fastest way to getting, you know, your fungal numbers up, because you're composting right in the field, is what you're essentially doing with that, but it has to be well managed grazing. You can't just, you know, 16 acres. You know, Graham wouldn't want to just turn, you know, 5 cows out here and let them graze all summer. You know, he'd want to have, you know, 20 cows and have them in small paddocks and just really be aggressively moving them every day or two. And, you know, that's why you're going to need 300 sheep to really do this right. Sorry. But they're hair sheep, so you don't have to shear them, so you got that going. Yeah, Schaefer.
So Keith, can't we just jumpstart the system by adding manure to if he could get his hand on some manure close by?
Yeah.
Could
So
we jumpstart it that way?
So good question. The question is, can he jumpstart the system by adding manure? Absolutely.